Well, my fellow Chancellor, Sir Thomas Allen, Lady Allen, my Lord Mayor, Lady Mayoress, distinguished colleagues, thank you very much, Professor Danny Donoghue, for that very generous introduction. And thank you too for the hospitality and the stimulation provided by you and your colleagues in the Institute of Advanced Studies, in the School of Government and International Affairs and the Department of Theology and Religious Studies. It's been a fantastic experience to be back here in Durham, to get to know again this wonderful university and cathedral town, and to get to know the really exceptional academic community that you have here. I feel very privileged to have been invited to deliver this 7th annual lecture honouring the memory of His late Majesty King Hussein. Few statesmen have been as adept as King Hussein at navigating across cultural divides. A globally respected figure, universally acknowledged as the most able and committed of the region's peacemakers, who spent decades trying to find common ground with Israel, supporting the West without becoming captive to it, and resisting sectarianism and extremism within and between his Arab neighbours. I'm also delighted to be able to acknowledge the role of His Royal Highness Prince Al Hassan bin Talal, King Hussein's brother, who delivered, as you've heard, the first lecture in this series, and whose friendship and guidance this great Durham University continues to enjoy. Prince Hassan was one of my most engaging and lively board members when I was president of the International Crisis Group, and he's devoted an immense part of his life to promoting interfaith and intercultural dialogue, albeit, as he would be the first to admit, with depressingly modest results in his own immediate neighbourhood. I remember us agreeing a few years ago that waiting for peace in the Middle East called to mind that old story about the man told to wait on the walls of Jerusalem to report the coming of the millennium. Asked what he thought of the job, the man famously replied, well, from some standpoints it could be considered boring, but at least the work is steady. Well, Australia and Australians are probably not most people's first choice as cross-cultural navigators, but we have been learning very fast in recent decades as it's become obvious that our Asian or Indo-Pacific geography is going to be far more relevant to our future than our European history. As I said in one of my first speeches after I became Foreign Minister in 1988, this region is where we must find a place and a role if we are to develop our full potential as a nation. This is where we live and must learn the business of normal neighbourhood civility. We've had some rather hard lessons to learn in that respect. One that has become a textbook example of cross-cultural miscommunication occurred back in 1993 when my then Prime Minister Paul Keating became unhappy, not unreasonably, about then Malaysian Prime Minister Mahathir's deep reluctance, essentially on Asia's for Asians sorts of grounds, his reluctance to participate in a meeting of the Australia-initiated new body, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, or APEC. As was Paul Keating's wont, he made his views known publicly, saying, quote, I couldn't care less, frankly, whether he comes or not. APEC is bigger than all of us, Australia, the US, Malaysia, Dr. Mahathir and any other recalcitrant, close quotes. This was met with full throttle rage from Mahathir, whose demands for a public apology and threats of a complete breakdown in bilateral relations until one was forthcoming were made with great vigour. Keating's initial response was to see this eruption as completely out of proportion to what was, in Australian terms, a pretty mild sort of a comment, and not to back down. I mean, recalcitrant may not be a complimentary expression, but nor is, in English, it a particularly abusive expression, carrying with it, as it does, some flavour of grudging admiration for the willfulness being demonstrated. But then we became aware that in translation into Malay, absolutely none of that moderating flavour is carried over. The roughly equivalent expressions for recalcitrant, kurang ajar and karas kepala, are completely denigratory, implying not only willfulness but lack of education and breeding, and behaviour calculated to bring discredit to one's family and community. So neighbourhood civility from us, one had to acknowledge this was not. And so after I remember wrestling for about half a night with the Prime Minister to get our language right. We found a form of words which incorporated the word regret, if not entirely that sentiment, in a way which did end up satisfying honour all round. For the record, the expression is, if my remarks were not intended to offend him and he's taken offence, naturally one would regret that. Pretty sophisticated bit of circumlocution, I thought, but the regret word, the R word, was indeed there. Cross-cultural miscommunication, when things get lost in translation, can sometimes, I also have to say, have its pleasures as well as its tensions. I remember very well our former Prime Minister, Bob Hawke, whose expression often became idiomatic when he wanted to make a strong point, saying in a speech to a business audience in Tokyo on Australian industrial relations reform, "We're just not interested in playing silly buggers on this issue." This was greeted with incomprehension, not just ordinary common and garden incomprehension, but full Monty head-shaking eye-rolling. It later transpired. Why? Because the interpreter, acting on the principle that when in doubt, keep it literal, had rendered the Prime Minister's sally as, "We're not interested in acting as laughing homosexuals." So there we go. When cross-cultural misunderstanding and miscommunication is no laughing matter, when it really bears on issues of peace and security, matters of life and death. How behaviour is perceived and understood, how messages between governments are conveyed and interpreted, how negotiations are conducted, whether those negotiations be aimed at ending or avoiding the recurrence of some particular deadly conflict, or whether they're aimed rather at crafting general new rules of the road on peace and security issues. All these sorts of negotiations are very much affected by cultural difference. The most familiar way of articulating and characterising cultural difference in the academic literature, and certainly the approach that resonates most with me, with all the practical experience that I've had as a foreign minister for 8 years, an international NGO head for nearly 10 years, and chair or member of a number of high-level international commissions. The most familiar way of articulating is to distinguish between low-context societies at one end of the spectrum and high-context societies at the other. The core of the difference and what explains the terminology is that in low-context societies, in the low-context society communications, the substance is in the message itself. What you hear, what you read is essentially what you get. By contrast, in high-context societies, most of the substantive meaning is implied and indirect. It has to be found in the surrounding context or setting within which the communication is made. Starting from that basic dichotomy, a number of other distinguishing paradigms of the two kinds of societies can be drawn out. In a low-context society, directness and getting to the point is prized. Time counts, patience is limited. History is of minimal interest. What matters is solving the current problem. Persuasion is all about the substantive merits of the argument. Subtlety and elusiveness are irritating. So too are elaborate social rituals. In professional and business settings, results are more important than relationships. Truth-telling is very highly valued. Dissimulation is bound to undermine personal trust and professional confidence. No-nonsense refutation is not offensive. Face is not especially important. It's not fear of shame in the perception of others that keeps one straight, so much as a sense of personal guilt. Above all, the prevailing ethic or impulse is individualist rather than communal or collective. By contrast, in a high-context society, the communal or group impulse, preserving harmony, is at the heart of not only social but business and professional interaction. Face, one's standing in the eyes of the group, how one appears to others, avoiding their disapproval, is of overwhelming importance and must be preserved at all costs. Direct language for rhetorical or public effect is one thing, but in any personal or business negotiation setting, directness is fraught with peril. Indirection, elusiveness, conveying meaning through hints and non-verbal gestures are valued and understood. Strict truth is not an imperative if dissimulation will avoid unpleasantness. Direct rebuffs are embarrassing, to be avoided. Elaborate courtesy is an absolutely necessary lubricant, and social foreplay not an optional extra. Personal relationships matter enormously and justify a great deal of time in building. And while time is not at all of the essence in conducting a negotiation, a sense of past time, how history impacts the present, is omnipresent. It might be thought that as the world becomes ever more global and interdependent, the kind of dichotomy that I just described must be becoming less and less real, with so many of the elites in quintessentially high-context societies like China now being educated in quintessentially low-context countries like the United States and only marginally less low-context, Australia, the United Kingdom. Surely, one thinks, they must be bringing home quite different habits of discourse, which must be beginning to permeate the way diplomacy and business are conducted. In my observation, there's some truth in that, but not nearly as much as one might think. And fundamental change really will be a long time coming. It's still domestic publics, homegrown political elites that set the tone, and that tone is still very much domestic culture bound. And that means that when it comes to players whose cultural starting points are toward different ends of the low context, high context spectrum, there is still enormous potential for discordance, both in the kind of bilateral crisis that erupted over Paul Keating's remark about the Malaysian Prime Minister's recalcitrance, and above all when it comes to formal negotiation, not least in a peace and security context. In the case of cross-cultural negotiation, I really can't do better here than to quote the doyen of academic writers in this field, Raymond Cohen, who puts it like this: putting the two paradigms together in the same room in an intercultural encounter produces some interesting reactions. American negotiators tend to be surprised by their interlocutors' preoccupation with history and hierarchy, preference for principle over nitty-gritty detail, personalised and repetitive style of argument, lack of enthusiasm for explicit and formal agreement, willingness to sacrifice substance to form. They're frustrated by their partner's reluctance to put all their cards on the table, intransigent bargaining, invasiveness, dilatoriness, and readiness to walk away from the table without any agreement at all. Non-Western negotiators, he goes on, tend to be surprised by their interlocutors' ignorance of history, preoccupation with individual rights, obsession with immediate problem solving while neglecting the overall relationship, excessive bluntness, impatience, disinterest in establishing a philosophical basis for agreement, extraordinary willingness to make soft concessions, constant generation of new propositions, inability to leave a problem pending. They're frustrated by their American partners' occasional obtuseness and insensitivity, tendency to see things and present alternatives in black or white, either-or terms, appetite for crisis, habits of springing unpleasant surprises, intimidating readiness for confrontation, tendency to bypass established channels of authority, inability to take no for an answer, and obsession with tidying up loose ends and putting everything down on paper. End of quote. Of course, one should not make too much of these typologies. If every one of these characteristics were in full flight on every occasion that cross-cultural negotiators sat down together, then it's obviously difficult to imagine any agreement ever being reached about anything. As Cohen himself acknowledges, the skill and experience of professional negotiators will more often than not prevent incipient misunderstanding from getting out of hand. Moreover, and this is important, one has to recognise that for all the salience, which I'm emphasising, of the cultural dimension in negotiations, in most cases, the truth of the matter is that failure to reach agreement in cross-cultural, just as in monocultural contexts, is more likely to be the result of irreconcilable interests than misreading or misunderstanding. The really crucial ingredient for successful negotiation is the identification of shared interests. Power relativities also come into play. As I can well recall from multiple encounters as Australian Foreign Minister with my United States counterparts, when Washington wants something important, there's not much effort expended in softening up. You tend to hear it directly and you hear it clearly. This is where we're at, this is where you should be at, and if you didn't get the message the first time, here it is again. For the sake of good and loyal old friends, yes, we can bend our preferred positions a little, provided it doesn't involve any trade concessions on our part, but that's it. That's the style you get used to. Being in Australia of a similarly robust and direct cultural bent, we do some biting and scratching back, but at the end of the day, size and muscle does tend to prevail, and we withdraw to fight again another day. And yet, whatever other dynamics like this, interests, power relativities, may be in play, when it comes to cross-cultural exchanges, it's absolutely the case, in my experience, that the kind of cultural factors that I've been identifying can hinder, can complicate, can prolong, can ultimately frustrate negotiations, even when there is otherwise an identifiable basis for a cooperative solution. And it's crucial that this reality be recognised, particularly the role played by face, by consciousness of history, and the willingness or otherwise of interlocutors to be direct and confrontational. And it's crucial, if negotiations are to succeed, that these differences be seriously addressed by negotiators on both sides of the divide. Let me now give you some examples from my own experience as to how this might be done. Beginning with the Cambodian peace process back in 1989-93. Context: in the late 1980s, Cambodia was on its knees. Since 1970, the country had been ravaged successively by massive United States bombing, by civil wars, by the genocidal reign of terror of the Khmer Rouge, exceeded only by the Nazis in Europe, by invasion, by civil war again, resulting overall in the deaths of some 2 million Cambodians and the destruction of the lives of many more. The Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia in November 1978 brought an end to the worst of the Khmer Rouge reign of terror, but it triggered a new civil war, recurring bloody military engagements, the further displacement of large numbers of civilians, the inability of life generally to return to any kind of normality, all took a terrible toll. The continuing conflict was being played out at 3 distinct levels. Internally, there were 4 warring factions. Hun Sen's government on the one side, waging against a fragile coalition on the other of the non-communist group led by Prince Sihanouk, another non-communist group led by a gentleman called Son Sann, together with the communist Khmer Rouge. Each group was immensely distrustful of the others, even when they were notionally on the same basic side of the divide. Regionally, Vietnam supported Hun Sen. The 6 ASEAN members at the time supported his opponents. And at the great power level, China supported both the Khmer Rouge and Prince Sihanouk. The Soviet Union supported Hun Sen. The United States supported the 2 non-communist resistance groups. Things don't get much more complicated than this. Previous diplomatic efforts to bring peace to the country had all failed, most notably and recently the Paris International Conference on Cambodia in July-August 1989, which had been jointly chaired by France and Indonesia, which had explored the idea of a transitional power-sharing arrangement involving all 4 of the internal groups. But Hun Sen's government and its international backers, Vietnam and Russia, refused to accept any role at all for the Khmer Rouge. This decision, in turn, however, was unacceptable. This position was unacceptable to China, which, even though it was starting to feel its wings and under Western and other pressure, was feeling increasingly uneasy about its genocidal client. China had continued to strongly support the Khmer Rouge politically, financially, and with military materiel, and for reasons primarily of face, was unwilling to be seen to be responding to external pressure to force it to step aside. It was to break this impasse that the Australian peace proposal was put forward, the idea which, as Foreign Minister, I spelled out to Parliament in November 1989, was that to sidestep the power-sharing issue which had bedevilled the previous Paris conference, and to constrain the role of the Khmer Rouge in the transitional arrangements, which was proving so problematic for obvious reasons, the United Nations itself should be involved in an unprecedentedly direct and extensive way in the civil administration of Cambodia during an extended transitional period. And at the heart of the idea of giving a central role to the United Nations, not just in peacekeeping, not just in election monitoring, but in the actual governance of the country during a transitional period, the heart of the idea was that this would give China a face-saving way of withdrawing its support from the Khmer Rouge, which would then, we hoped, Khmer Rouge would wither on the vine. And it was eventually this face-saving solution which unlocked the conflict and eventually brought long-awaited and desperately needed peace to the country, with the Khmer Rouge ultimately indeed withering away as Chinese support was withdrawn. There was a long and complicated diplomatic road ahead with many twists and turns, but I won't burden you with that particular story now. That said, there's just one other thing I do think worth mentioning here, and that's one other way in which face was important in these negotiations. Australia played a crucial role in not only coming up with the basic UN-centred formula, but in selling that formula diplomatically around the region and beyond, and above all in demonstrating that it was operationally deliverable. Our idea captured the imagination of the Indonesian Foreign Minister, Ali Alatas, with whom I had developed a very close personal relationship, particularly important in high-context societies like Indonesia, as we worked together to resolve various other bilateral, rather acute tensions we had between us. And he decided in his capacity as Paris Conference co-chair in early 1990 to explore the proposal which I'd put forward by convening an informal meeting of the relevant Asian players. And he asked Australia to assist him by attending that meeting as a, quote, resource delegation. So working frantically for a few weeks, sending a technical mission to the region, consulting behind the scenes with the United Nations, we produced for that conference a 155-page compilation of papers which became known as the Red Book, which covered in detail all the necessary elements of comprehensive solution and its implementation, and what did in fact prove to be the foundation for all the subsequent stages of the negotiation. The point here that I want to make is that what made our work so influential, I believe, is that we stood back and let Ali Alatas, we let the Indonesians make the running with that work, playing, as we did, a supporting role, but not a visibly, publicly leading role. We made it clear that we were working to and through our Asian colleague. And certainly in a high-context diplomatic environment, although this is probably generally true of life itself, you can get a hell of a lot done when you let others take the credit. And as often as not, will get anyway what credit is due if you approach things that way. Second case study that I want to mention is the Iran nuclear negotiation from 2003 through to last year. In my view, although I acknowledge that others here may not share it, there is nothing not to like about the nuclear deal which was finally reached last year between the permanent 5 Security Council members, plus Germany on the one hand and Iran on the other. A deal whereby there is a complete end to the plutonium path to a bomb. There are very significant limitations and inbuilt delays into any enriched uranium path to a bomb. Any possible breakout time is extended from the previously assessed 2 to 3 months to at least a year, and there are highly intrusive monitoring and verification mechanisms put in place to ensure that these strictures are observed. And it's particularly the case that it's a deal to be admired when one considers that the only alternatives the critics have ever been able to offer are either sanctions continuing to be applied with no likely result other than Iran's nuclear program, such as it might be, proceeding completely unhindered, or military action, which has been almost universally acknowledged as not likely to delay any nuclear program by more than 3 years or so, and would be certain to unleash a storm of retaliatory action by Iran in the region and beyond. The only thing I think to lament about the Iran agreement is that it was not signed and sealed, as it could have been a decade earlier, when Iran had less than 200 centrifuges in its possession, producing highly enriched uranium, as compared with the 19,000 centrifuges it had installed by 2015. In the years that it has taken for diplomatic sanity to prevail, the Middle East has endured myriad avoidable tensions, lost opportunities for security cooperation. And herein lies, I think, an important tale about cross-cultural bargaining. From 2003 to 2006, Iran made clear to anyone willing to listen that it would agree to all of what proved to be the key elements of the present deal, including measures to block both uranium and plutonium pathways to a bomb and obtrusive monitoring mechanisms to ensure ample advance notice of a likely breakout. All that was needed in return, beyond of course the lifting of sanctions as implementation proceeded, was formal recognition of Iran's right to enrich, quote unquote, uranium, language enshrined, as much as one might wish otherwise. One might wish it wasn't there, but it is enshrined in the Non-Proliferation Treaty, recognising, as that treaty does, the right of all parties to the treaty to engage in all stages of the nuclear fuel cycle as part at least of a peaceful nuclear energy program. In discussions with the European Union in 2003-2004, Iran voluntarily froze its then minimal, as I've said, enrichment program, pending negotiation of a full accord. Iran also declared its willingness to apply the additional protocol, which, without going into technical detail, allows for much more far-reaching and stringent monitoring by the International Atomic Energy Agency than is called for under standard monitoring and verification arrangements. But those commitments of Iran ended in 2005, owing to the continued insistence of the EU, backed by the United States, that Iran had to abandon enrichment completely and entirely before the West would sign up to anything at all. If at that time the West had been prepared to settle for effectively containing Iran's nuclear program rather than destroying every last sensitive component of it, a deal would have been possible. And I know that because I was very much involved at the fringes of the ongoing negotiations. In early 2006, the International Crisis Group, which I headed from 2000-2009, as you've heard, published a comprehensive delayed limited enrichment proposal that included all the features of the deal now reached in Vienna last year. And this was the first time that any such detailed proposal had been either developed or certainly put on the public record. And it generated a lot of attention. I'm confident, on the basis of many hours of productive dialogue that I had with senior Iranian officials in Tehran, in New York, Geneva and elsewhere, that this proposal would have broken the deadlock. It had all the right elements of an effective compromise, but with the United States not talking to Iran at any level, and the EU talking but not listening, the effort went absolutely nowhere. The point is that the truth is that the Iranians were never going to accept what they perceived as second-class status under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It was only when President Barack Obama's administration acknowledged that and commenced direct back-channel talks in 2011 that progress became possible. The key was the recognition that Iran's sense of honour, very much bound up with history, had to be accommodated. While no one should be under any illusion at all, and I'm certainly not, that Iran has been a model international citizen, or is likely to become one anytime soon, the perception that the country's ambition has always been to acquire nuclear weapons, and possibly to use them, does involve, I think, a quite fundamental misreading of the dynamics in play. My own judgment, based on rather more dialogue with senior Iranian officials over a rather longer period of time than has been managed by most of the critics, my position, my understanding is that Iran, whatever engineering research it may have conducted in the past, whatever fuel making and missile delivery capabilities it may have developed more recently, has never been close to deciding actually to build nuclear weapons. For a whole range of reasons, both principled and prudential, which I'm happy to spell out if anyone wants to challenge me further on that when we get to Q&A. If that's right, if Iran has never had any intention to actually cross that red line and actually build nuclear weapons, the question becomes, why did Iran walk the precipice for so long by building a visible breakout capability which was bound to spook the West, bound to spook Israel, and bound to spook also its Arab neighbours? The answer, I believe, is overwhelmingly national pride. It's people's desire to demonstrate, people at all levels, not just the elites, but right down, the desire to demonstrate that Iran is a power to be reckoned with, a country that has impressive technical prowess, and that there are limits to its willingness to suffer international humiliation. Iranians live and breathe their history in a way that Western interlocutors have really found quite difficult to grasp. Iranians vividly remember the overthrow orchestrated by the CIA and the British government and British intelligence of the elected government of Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953. They remember the West's prolonged support for the hated Shah and for Iraq in its brutal war with Iran in the 1980s, even after Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein employed chemical weapons. Still, the West supported Iraq against Iran. And they certainly remember when US President George W. Bush labelled the country part of an axis of evil, despite its cooperation with the United States in Afghanistan. It's perfectly understandable that even after the agreement now reached, many will not readily be persuaded of Iranian sincerity. For quite a while, I have to say, I found that difficult myself, not least because Iran is a classic high-context society where the national negotiating style among moderates and hardliners alike tends to be anything but frank and direct. And even when you do a private, thoughtful moderation, this is often accompanied by a kind of public thunder that makes it hard, until you get used to it, to assess real intent. In this respect, I vividly remember one encounter I had in Tehran in the mid-2000s, 2005, 2006, can't remember, in Tehran with a very senior Foreign Office official who, in private conversation with me over a period of a couple of hours, explicitly acknowledged the force of the argument that I was putting to him, that Western acceptance of any deal would require Iranian acceptance of a monitoring and verification regime significantly more rigorous than the prevailing international standard. There's no doubt that he understood the point perfectly, didn't disagree with it. But we then went together to address a public round table, in the course of which, at one point, glowering at me across the table, he said with great force, "And some people are misguided enough to think that Iran could ever submit itself to a verification regime with burdens greater than applied to any other state. Let me say to them in words of one syllable, that is inconceivable." I went up to him at the coffee break afterwards and said, so notwithstanding our conversation this morning, am I to take it that what I've just heard is your last word on the subject? Smiling very sweetly at me, he said, "No, first word." Third example of, and final examples I want to use of actual experience of this business, are the multilateral commissions that I've been engaged with, as you've heard, dealing with atrocity crimes and nuclear weapons. This is another quite different kind of international negotiating arena in which I've had quite a deal of experience, and where cultural difference in both background and foreground is real and has to be navigated constantly with a pretty fair degree of dexterity. And that arena is the compilation, as I've said, of reports by blue ribbon panels and commissions, of which I've been a member of several and co-chair in particular of two, the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty in 2001, which I co-chaired with the Algerian diplomat Mohamed Sanoun, and which gave birth to this new concept of the responsibility to protect populations against genocide and other mass atrocity crimes. And the other one being the International Commission on Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, which I co-chaired with the former Japanese Foreign Minister Yoriko Kawaguchi. Both commissions had all-star casts of members drawn from all four corners of the globe. There's a lot more that I could say about the absolutely fascinating dynamics of these panels, more than I've time for now, given that fascinating because their members are invariably from countries spread right across the low context, high context spectrum. But let me give you just a couple of examples of the way in which cultural imperatives do intrude and how differences can, for all the difficulty along the way, be managed if one works at it. In the case of the Nuclear Commission, the biggest problem that I had was working with my personally delightful but irremediably high context Japanese co-chair, who was as articulate as anyone possibly could be about the horrors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and intellectually as committed as I was to achieving a nuclear weapon-free world by the fastest possible route, but who didn't want to say so in any way which could possibly offend anybody, least of all the commune of senior foreign policy bureaucrats, foreign office bureaucrats, past and present, who were sort of watching over her like hawks, notionally sharing the national distaste for nuclear weapons, but at the same time totally committed to the theory of extended nuclear deterrence and loving the United States nuclear umbrella, under which they believe they should be permanently sheltering. So this was the context. We actually eventually got there, agreeing on a report with some quite sharp edges. But I think really the only reason we got there was because the other group with which my co-chair had to live, apart from the Japanese Gaimusho hawks leaning over her shoulder, was the Commission itself, which she was co-chairing, which was united in not wishing to settle for lowest common denominator fudge. But let me tell you, it was very, very hard work involving multiple acknowledgements around the table of deep respect of those with different perspectives before we got there. In the case, the other example I want to mention is the Commission on Intervention in State Sovereignty, whose central task was to find a way out of the consensus-free zone of debate internationally over the right of humanitarian intervention, which you may recall had divided and largely paralysed the international community throughout the 1990s, in the face of the most terrible atrocities being perpetrated in Rwanda, the Balkans and elsewhere. The global north rather liked the idea of humanitarian intervention, sending in the Marines in response to extreme human rights catastrophes, even if it didn't deliver very much in practice. It liked the sort of theory of it. The global south, on the other hand, with so many members proud of their recently won sovereign independence, deeply mindful of a long history of missions civilisatrices, civilising missions so-called by the imperial powers, they were totally resistant to the notion that the big guys had any acknowledged right to throw their weight around, whatever the circumstances. The key to finding consensus in our very culturally diverse commission was linguistic, with humanitarian intervention language carrying so much historical baggage and summoning up so many images of shame and humiliation, there was no way that it could be redefined, however hard we worked at it, by rational persuasion. The concept, the language expressed in those terms, had to go. Our answer was to replace right to intervene language with the language of the responsibility to protect. And this did succeed in completely shifting the terms of the debate. What was in issue now was not the right of major military powers to do anything they like, but rather the responsibility of everyone to protect their own and other civilians, and with the emphasis being no longer on top-down intervention, but the protection of vulnerable men, women and children at risk. Of course, there was a lot more to all that debate than just these optics. The new approach did emphasise prevention, not just reaction, and a whole spectrum of reaction options falling short of coercive military action. But the key to such acceptance, as R2P has won, and we might want to debate the extent to which it has been successful when we get to question time, that's up to you. The key to such acceptance as the concept, the new norm of responsibility to protect has won, was the way in which I think high context cultural objections were in fact met. So might I conclude by repeating a point that I made earlier, that in finding common ground in peace and security related negotiations, or indeed on anything else, cultural difference is by no means the be-all and end-all. Competing interests, competing power relativities also very much come into play, and in particular situations may be much more decisive. But cultural difference certainly matters, and it matters a lot. If this world is ever to become safer and saner, as we all hope it will, we must continue to pay very close attention to how those differences play out, much more attention, in fact, than many of our leaders have paid in the past. And we must make every effort in all our international dealings to respect and accommodate those differences. Thank you.